Hey, thank you for joining us. We're going to talk about this whole email compromise thing because business email compromise is still happening. And I had a couple of calls with listeners just this week, helping them out with some real problems. You probably notice if you're a subscriber to the newsletter that you can just hit reply and ask a question or even schedule a meeting. I set aside some time every week to do free work and consulting for people. So sometimes I'll actually get on their machines like I did with Jean's here recently and help her figure out, was her email hacked? What can she do? How can she recover her accounts? It was really quite a mess, and I was so impressed with her. She's 85 years old and was kind of downplaying herself a little bit, and I don't think she should have been, because she certainly understood the computers much better than many people. But it brings up the point about how confusing it is nowadays because of how good the hosers have gotten. So these hosers are out there trying to suck up your data so they can suck up your money from the account, right? Running a hose into your gas tank, taking everything they can, and that's a real problem. And it's a particular problem for seniors, for business people. And I've had clients that have come to me that have had their entire operating account emptied. And I've told on the show here before the story of Olga over in Eastern Europe who managed to steal $45 million from this one company. Now, that's a lot, right? You look at that, you hear that, and you say, yeah, well, that's not me, right? Well, of course not. In most cases, it's not. But they use similar techniques just to get into your bank account to get a few hundred or even a few $1,000s. A very good friend of mine, again, he's older than I am, but he is pretty competent with computers, but he got confused because you look at these things and you have to shake your head. I see it all of the time, even with younger kids. There have been some studies out there that talk about how the young generations, the under 30-year-olds, have even less concern about whether or not something's legitimate online than we do, than any of the older generations. They'll go ahead and trade personal information for a donut. I remember that study some years ago. Stuff that you and I might not. But then comes in the problem of, is this legitimate? It was giving this information too personal. What might the bad guys do with it? What should I do? And that's a question we get all of the time, and particularly on the business side, where they're trying to protect stuff, but at the same time, that information has to be used for them to do their jobs. And businesses have personal information on you and me and other customers of theirs. So what's going to happen? How are you going to deal with this? It gets really confusing very, very quickly. So we've got to be careful when we're talking about the whole business email compromise thing and what should you do, what shouldn't you do. You probably know the basics. You don't want to give your account number to someone. I'm going to get a little more basic than that. You do not want to give any information to someone who reached out to you. It kind of reminds me of Dr. Hawkins. I was reading Dr. David Hawkins, one of his books, and his first job was out on the streets. He was selling roofing for homes and selling siding and various other little home repair things. And he was a young guy. He was, I think, about 20 years old, and this would have been back in the 40s. And the things were a little tough back then, 40s and 50s. And there were a lot of door-to-door salesmen. And people would let salesmen in from time to time. A lot of people, you kind of feel obliged. It's a hot day. You offer them some water or whatever it might be. And they come in and then they sell you something. Most of us don't say no. Let me put it this way. I'm getting that backwards. Most of us say no to a salesperson because we don't want to be tempted to buy as opposed to be sold. And, a lot of people put it as, we don't want to be sold. And I can see that wording, and I can see how that wording would make sense. But in reality, we're afraid we're going to get sold because they've obviously got a pretty good proposition or they wouldn't be in business. And on our side, we're sitting there saying, well, I've got this limited pile of cash and I've got to pay my bills this month and, inflation, and I don't have that greater job, and all of the things that go through people's minds come to play. So Dr. Hawkins was out there and getting rejected at every door, and he was doing everything right. He looked around, and the other guys that were selling roofing door to door all had on nice pants and a shirt and tie and a jacket, and would knock on the door and get rejected immediately. And then he realized what he needed to do in order to get into the homes to talk to the homeowners is look different. Not look like a salesman, but look like a contractor. And I know contractors that are using this today. What he did was he dressed up in bib overalls and a little dirty. His hands were a little dirty. He was a little unclean, if you will. Hair was a mess. And he had in his pocket a ruler and a tape and a hammer hanging off the side. And he made himself look like someone who would work on a roof, even though he wasn't someone who would be working on the roof. He was someone who would be selling it and getting the team out. Now, people would see him at the door and open the door. Okay, this is strange. What's going on? This is obviously not a door-to-door sales guy. And he would then talk to them, come in and say, hey, I am a contractor in the area, and I noticed you have this problem on your roof, and I had some extra material. I'm not sure if you'd want me to fix it or not. So he didn't look like a sales guy. He didn't sound like a sales guy. And he would make his daily quota by noon easily every day by changing all of that. Now, the reason I told you that story about Dr. Hawkins, who went on to be a clinical psychiatrist, by the way, is that's what these hosers are doing. They are trying to look like something that is at least innocuous, if not something that you would expect to work on your roof. Or in these cases, it's from the bank. It's from a client. It's from your boss. It's from someone else that you need to respond to. And they do this by faking the return address on the email. And they do that also by playing around with the links that are in the email. They might register a domain that's very similar to, maybe it's your bank, maybe it's YouTube or somebody else. Oftentimes it's something smaller, but they mess with the domain and they register it, and now they go off and try and con you into sending them money somehow. So with a business email compromise, what they're often trying to do is get your banking information or get into your email account and have a look at the invoices that your business sends out. So that what they can do then is take your invoice, change it up a little bit, maybe put a new date on it and a new invoice number, and then also maybe change the amount, but more likely they'll leave the amount alone. And once they're into your email box, they know what the next step is. The next step is, okay, I've got the invoice, I've modified the invoice, I even have the email address that invoice was sent to by this legitimate company. So now what do? They go ahead and they send that invoice off to that person or maybe multiple companies to get them to pay it. And many companies don't pay a ton of attention to the invoices that are coming in. Because what they should do is make sure they follow up with anything that's different, anything that's odd, anything that's strange. So that follow-up means, wait a minute now, they're changing their bank account number that they want us to send the money into. Typically, that's an ACH transaction is what it's called. And wait a minute now, maybe I should pick up the phone and call my vendor who sent me the invoice and make sure that that's legitimate. That is such a common practice nowadays by the hosers who are trying to get you to do these things. That's why they want to compromise your email account if you're a business person. If you're an individual, the number one thing that they're trying to do is, again, get access to your bank accounts. But they're not going to find invoices in your email that you're sending out to vendors. But what they're hoping to do is find your bank having sent you email. And you say, well, why does that matter, Craig? Of course the bank sends me email. My bank is TD Bank, whatever it might be. And I get email from them about balances and things. There's no account information in there, is there? Oh, no. So what do I need to worry about? Well, there is a lot to worry about because there's a lot they can do once they gain access to your email account. So we're going to talk about that and what the whole deal is behind that and why they want access to your bank account. All right, how do they get that? Just from an email from the bank saying that your statement's ready. Well, we'll talk about that. I also want to talk a little bit more about what you can do here. I put a big article in the newsletter. It's up on my website, the latest on business email compromise. And this is talking about a quick way that hosers are destroying your businesses, and they're living high on the hog at your expense. You can find it online, craigpeterson.com. Thank you for joining us. We're talking about what happens with emails and email compromises. What are the bad guys trying to do? How are they doing it? Because if you don't understand that, you will not keep yourself safe. So this is an important show today. So why do the bad guys want access to your personal email account? Well, they can do something like what happened with my buddy, where they got his email account and then he was delivering food for, these home delivery companies. And he, of course, got emails, and those emails had in them his statement, right? And it had, this is how much you made, and he gets paid, and they deposit it directly into his account. Isn't that all well and good? His email did not have the account number in it. But what happened is he's delivering for DoorDash and I think one other, and they send an email. Well, the bad guys got into his email account. They changed the password on the email account. Now, they don't always do that. These hosers realize that if they change your password, you're going to immediately notice something's going on. What they'd rather do is keep an eye on your email box, because here's what they do next. They go ahead and say, okay, he's working for DoorDash. This email account is what he's using as his account name at DoorDash. And that's one of the reasons I do not like the requirement of having to use your email address as your account name or account login. So they knew, okay, it's xyz@gmail.com, for instance. Not picking on Google here at all. And then they reached out to DoorDash and said, hey, I need to change my account number to deposit money in. So now I'm going to conflate a bunch of different stories together to give you kind of the most common way of doing it. And I don't want to throw DoorDash under the bus here either. But what happens next typically is the bad guys will open one of these bank accounts that's designed for transients. You know how we have a lot of illegal aliens in the country? Migrants, as some people call them. Well, those migrants need a way to put their money from that they're paid under the table because they can't work legally into that bank account. So they can have a whole bunch of different banks now that offer that type of a service where you don't have to prove who you are, where you're from, where you live, all the stuff that you and I have to do. No. All they have to do is open the account. So these bad guys, these people that are overseas even, will go ahead and set up one of these bank accounts in the U.S., perfectly legitimate bank account, with no way to trace it. It's insane, people, what we're doing in order to coddle these illegal immigrants, right? We used to be a nation of laws. That's what set us apart. But I digress. So now they've got access to your email. They've sent an email off to your employer, and they've asked to change your direct deposit account so that it deposits it into the bank that's used by these illegals, and the money was going in there. He lost 2 paychecks that way, and he called up and tried to figure out what was going on, right? So we'll just leave the story right there. He was made whole, and everything was great. But you can't track that money. It's shocking to me. It's absolutely shocking how badly now we are handling this whole illegal immigrant problem. You know, when the first thing you do coming to a country that supposedly has a basis in law, and so that laws are governing what we should not be doing, not men, but laws, the first thing that you do is you break a law coming into a country governed by laws. That just tells you the whole story right there, doesn't it? So they put that money into that bank account that they opened without any real verification at all about who they were. And then that money typically gets transferred. Now, this is where mules come in. You might have seen, the course, Dinesh D'Souza's movie about the mules, and Clint Eastwood had one too, Mule. It was a really good movie if you haven't seen it. I think it's worth seeing. But the mules in this case are people in the U.S. who have been conned into, in some cases they know that they're doing something illegal, but into doing something illegal, which is they will take that money out of that bank account that was set up by that obviously illegal person, right, who's a hoser stealing money from people, and then they will take it and put it into, let's say, a PayPal account. And then another person is monitoring that PayPal account. And when the money comes in there, they'll transfer it to another account. So the mules move the money around, Americans, a few times, and then it gets sent out of the country. We have been arresting mules. So if you are doing something like that or have been tempted to, be careful. Because once it hits American hands, it's a little easier to trace, even using these bank accounts that are set up so illegals can use them and have a bank account, right? Because, my goodness, they need a bank account too, don't they? So that's kind of the way it worked with my friend, and I kind of pulled together some facts from a couple of different cases to give you more or less the normal way of doing it. The other way of doing it that they do all of the time is they realize, okay, your bank is TD Bank. So what do they do now? Well, they realize that because they see the emails that came from TD Bank, Bank of America, Citizens, whatever your local bank is. And they now know that you have an account there. Well, as I said earlier, what is your account name on the bank? Now, I know Bank of America lets you use an account name, so I do. I make up a name. I mean, totally made up. A couple of random words stuck together. That's my account name, or a few in some cases, which is similar to how I create passwords. So I will go to the bank, right, and to log in, and I put in my account name. That works really well because if they've got access to my email and they know the email address, so Craig at craigpeterson.com, for instance, or my business email, Craig at mainstream.net, but that Craig at craigpeterson.com email address now, they'll go ahead and try and log in with that over at the bank. And it's not going to work because I don't use my email address. So that's a very, very first firewall of 3 firewalls I use when I'm dealing with banks, etc. if you're using the email address for your bank, what they'll do now is they'll go to your bank, they'll enter in your email address as the login name, and then they'll click on Forgot My Password. What happens next? Well, the bank is going to likely send you an email with a link that you can click on to reset the password on your bank account. So now they are just monitoring your email account. The bank sends that email. They click on the link. They delete the email so you can't see what just happened. Although if you were to dig into it, you'd see in your sent box what happened and your trash can if it hadn't been emptied. And now they have full access to your bank account. So there's a bunch of really good things to learn from what I've just discussed here in the last two segments. Review it. You can listen to it online at craigpeterson.com/podcast. Find this podcast, and we'll go from there, right? So we've got more coming up, of course, so stick around. We're going to move on right here. craigpeterson.com. Hey, we've got a couple of guys out there that have figured out how to unlock Tesla's software features. This is a very big deal for a lot of people. Has your car manufacturer decided to start charging you monthly for things you paid for? This whole idea of subscriptions for cars has been around for a while now, and it's getting a little bit out of hand. Some of the car companies have backed down on it, others haven't. Some are planning on introducing it and have not introduced it yet. If you've been buying software for a while, you go and you buy the latest version of Windows, you buy Office 2019, you buy all of this different software. But the way things have gone in the Microsoft world now, pretty much everything is pay by the month. And that's actually not a bad way to do it. It's easy. You can get free updates. It just goes on and on. Now, Microsoft does not take good care of you. That's a completely different issue here. Car manufacturers have been looking at trying to do the same thing, and some of them have. BMW, Volvo, and many other high-end car makers, and really kind of lower ones too, including, I think, Nissan did the same trick, are saying, hey, you want to use heated seats? No problem. You can pay us monthly for those heated seats. Now, a lot of people argue, hey, wait a minute, I paid for that heated seat, obviously, when I bought the car because it was built into the car. It was already there. This was not a retrofit. And that's an argument that's been used for a long time in other industries as well. I remember IBM, they still do this to this day. It's cheaper for a company to make a single model that has all of the same stuff in it, but not necessarily turn on the features for you, than it is to try and keep track of, okay, well, this one needs heated seats, this one needs rear view camera, this one needs this type of glass, etc., etc. And IBM found the same thing. In fact, in the 60s and on, you buy a mainframe. And that mainframe would probably come with maybe a little more memory than you had ordered, or more storage or CPU power. And digital equipment did the same thing. They would come out, if you did an upgrade, they'd come out with a magic key and put the key in. Think of this as a golden key. Put the key into the computer, turn the switch, and all of a sudden, ta-da, your computer just doubled its capacity. They didn't bring any equipment in. No, obviously they would have to at one point. I remember upgrading our IBM 360, and it was a 360-30, and upgrading to, I'm trying to remember how much memory it was. I think it might have been 92 megabytes, and it took two guys to roll it in. It was huge. It was a huge rack of core memory. So they rolled this thing in and set it all up, and and off you go. You're off and running. But other things were accessed via this key, and that same thing is true today. A lot of software that you buy, you upgrade it, and in fact, nothing really changed. All that happened was a software key was installed to make it work better. Think of demos. How many pieces of demo software have you downloaded? And it's fully functional, except maybe it's going to, if it's a video editor, it's going to put a little watermark on top of the video it exports, or maybe you can only use it for so many hours, right? There's a lot of different things that it does, or that companies do. And then when it's time, you've bought it, they just authorize it, right? Install a key. So the car manufacturers are doing that same thing. But in some cases, the car manufacturers are charging you for the heated seat up front when you buy the car, and then they're trying to charge you a monthly usage fee for using the feature that you literally already paid for. It's not like it's built into the car already. No, it's a brand new feature. So doesn't that get to be a bit of a problem at some point, somehow, right? Well, obviously it does. And that's why there's been a lot of pushback. Tesla is a car that is completely controlled by software. Volvo started doing that a few years ago as well, which is one of the main reasons I did not like Volvos. Now, the computer would override the driver based on what the computer thought. So, for instance, it used to be you turn the steering wheel, and that steering wheel is connected through a number of mechanical mechanisms to the actual wheels themselves. So when you're turning that steering wheel, even if the car is off, you could turn it. It might be hard, right? Think of the old trucks without power steering, but you could still do it because there is a direct mechanical linkage between that steering wheel and the front wheels. Same thing with the brakes. Nowadays, of course, for many years, we've had hydraulic brake systems, but you can still push down the brake. There's a mechanical linkage to the master valve, right, master cylinder, and that now puts a pressure on the brakes, and the brakes will still work. Mechanical linkage. Same thing with the gas pedal, the fuel, the accelerator. You push that down, and there's a rod, a mechanical linkage that goes up to the fuel injector. Of course, before that, we didn't have fuel injectors, but before that, it would connect to the carburetor, right, and it would change things so the car would go faster, get more fuel to the engine. Pretty much all of the cars today use various types of drive-by-wire. You might remember Toyota having a huge problem because the brakes were controlled by computer, and occasionally you'd be stopped at a light with your foot on the brake, and the car would leap forward and jump into the intersection for you. You know, what the heck, oncoming traffic, T-bones, yeah, that sort of thing. GM had a similar problem. Do you remember their V864 engine? Well, that did much the same thing, right? It would shut off cylinders in order to save fuel. This is during the fuel crisis of Jimmy Carter. What's this with Democrat presidents and fuel crises? And he, anyways, they ended up pulling that whole engine back. And it goes back, the first case I'm aware of was a machine that took x-rays. And it was computer controlled, so you get the right dosage. But the computer, much like the Toyota software with the brake pedal, the computer in this x-ray machine had what's called a stack overflow and was killing people. Yeah, fun, eh? So now our cars are run by computers. Cars like Teslas, these electric cars, completely run by computers. So even though you've got a steering wheel, you've got the brakes, you've got the accelerator, none of them actually do what you think they are doing anymore. That steering wheel just tells the computer, hey, I want to turn right. And I want to turn right this much. This is how aggressive I want to be with my right-hand turn. The same thing, a left-hand turn, or I hit the brakes. and it says, oh, okay, he wants to hit the brakes. And they do some kind of cool things, like if you hit the brakes really rapidly, but not terribly hard, the computer will interpret that and say, wait a minute, I bet you he wanted to hit the brakes even harder, so I'm going to actually hit the brakes harder than he hit them, and it overrides you. And in that case, it might save your life. It's been proven to actually be pretty good. But how about those cars now when you're going around a corner? Let's say you're going in a straight line and you want to avoid something in the road ahead, so you turn the steering wheel hard, and the car overrides you because the computer says, wait a minute, you're going to generate more than 1G of lateral force. So I don't care if you want to turn that steering wheel hard, I'm going to ignore you. And we got more on this coming right up. Stick around, CraigPeterson.com. And we're talking about the reasons you might not want to buy a new car. And it doesn't just have to be an electric car, because this technology has now been woven into pretty much everything driving on the road today, at least newer stuff. Electric cars all have this drive-by-wire completely. Mechanical cars, if you will, internal combustion engines, trucks, all have it built in now. It's very rare to see any mechanical linkages going from the driver of the vehicle to the actual components of the car that are actually doing the work, right? And there's some nice things about it. I mentioned the override, but there's some problems too. For instance, even with things like traction control or anti-lock brakes. Let's say you're trying to brake on sand and you need to stop quickly. Well, your anti-lock brakes are not going to allow you to stop quickly because they're going to say, wait a minute, I'm sliding. The better way to handle this on sand, the braking, is to slam on the brakes and let the sand pile up in front of your wheel in order to stop abruptly. But the computer doesn't know that. Well, they're getting a little bit better. We'll see as time goes on. But you see, these things are all double-edged swords, and Tesla is kind of the most, the biggest sword target out there, if you will. So there's a lot of hackers who have been hacking cars. We saw Chrysler, for instance, where you could take over and remotely drive a car right off the road. Yeah, a bad guy, a hacker could. We've seen times where the police now have these little remote-controlled cars, kind of like kids play with, and they have basically an EMP inside of them, electromagnetic pulse mechanism, and they drive underneath the car, and they set it off, and that completely disables the computer, burns it out in many cases, and the car stops. I don't use that very often. How about the cars that have the wonderful GM OnStar system in them, which are remotely monitored and can be remotely stopped, unlocked, right? All of these types of things. So, for instance, the police say, yeah, we're following this GM car, and they're not yielding as quickly as we want them to, or maybe they'll never yield. So they just contact OnStar and ta-da, go through the mechanisms, and the engine will start slowing the car down. Hopefully the person pulls over to the side of the road, but, so you can be stopped. You can be tracked. And there are movements afoot right now to do exactly that at the state level for taxes. You're driving on a road. Theoretically, the gas tax pays for the roads. Of course, we know they use that money for many other things. But what if you're in a car that doesn't use gas? So there have been a lot of proposals out there. A lot of states now have decided to just charge you, if you have an electric car, an extra $200 a year as kind of a road tax to make up for it. Other states, like Massachusetts, has said, hey, here's what we'll do. There's computers in the cars, and the computers record all this wonderful information. So when you have that mandatory car inspection, we're going to download everything from your computer, and we're going to have a look at it, and we're going to charge you based on how many miles you drove. Well, of course, you didn't necessarily drive all those miles en masse, right? And the computers don't necessarily know that, but the lawmakers are trying to require that now. So the computers actually track everywhere you went and keep that almost forever. And that's what you might see in a GPS, for instance. Your last few locations where you've gone a little while, but now it's more and more. Teslas actually upload gigabytes worth of data per day sometimes, if you've been driving your Tesla car, up to Tesla, where it is keeping track of everywhere you drove and is keeping track of all of that GPS information. And they're using that to figure out where the roads are, get detailed maps. Because if you've studied cartography at all, you know that the companies that publish maps put purposely wrong information in them. They even, there's some great stories about how they've even had fake town put into a map. And the idea is, well, if someone steals our maps and republishes them or, changes it, makes it look like it's theirs, but this town appears or this distance is the same because we made it up, it's not real, then we know they stole that information. So you can't really trust those physical maps to be highly accurate. But if you're going to have a self-driving car, you not only need sensors that can see the road, that can see obstructions, you also need to be able to know exactly where the road is, at least according to the GPS up there. Can you imagine what would happen with these self-driving cars if the GPS satellite system went down? We know it's easily jammable. I mean, easily jammable. And I've got an article in my newsletter that turns out it's surprisingly easy to hack into a satellite. These low Earth satellites, think like Elon Musk's Starlink. So, good luck. Anyways, I digress. So the Tesla has all of this software, and you can get upgrades on your Tesla. So you can get speed upgrades. It has ludicrous mode, which is kind of cool. I like Mel Brooks too. And they have a lot of other little features. They have games and things in it. And it gets updates potentially daily from Tesla for the software. It's uploading information about your driving that day so that they can use that to help train the AI. Let's call it artificial intelligence. I'm not going to get into that argument right now about what exactly it is. And they then download all that information with new software onto the computers in your Tesla car. Okay, so Tesla charges you monthly, depending on what you're using, what you're doing. They might charge you an upgrade charge. Certainly this autonomous driving has been an upgrade for a long time, although it's not technically autonomous. And a lot of people are saying, hey, don't worry about it because, the driver's being monitored. Ford has its own autonomous system. Many of the other guys have it. GM certainly does. I'm not sure about Chrysler. They must have it. But it's okay because we're monitoring that driver. Well, I remember my mom, she got a Honda. This was years ago, the little roller skate Honda. And this was up in the Great White North, up in Canada. And it had a thing in it so that if you didn't have your seatbelt on, an alarm would go off. It's just this totally annoying buzzer that never timed out and was always buzzing. So if there's any weight at all, I took like 5 or 10 pounds of weight in that passenger seat, for instance, like she put groceries there or her purse there, the alarm would go off and would not stop. Isn't that fun? Yeah. So what did I do for her? Well, I reverse engineered how that system worked and disabled it. Snip, snip, all set. So how about that Tesla? How about these other autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles out there? Well, the same type of thing can happen. And I've got an article from electric.co, that's the name of the website. And these guys have a great little article on how hackers managed to completely unlock the Tesla software. So they were able to unlock features that were worth up to $15,000, right? Free heated seats, full self-driving package, because all of that is in the car to begin with, okay? These are software locked features or unlocked, depending on how you want to look at it. So they were able to do that. Effectively what I did to my mom's little Honda roller skate back in the day. And it's an issue, right? It's a real issue because they effectively jailbroke the Tesla. And you can bet that there'll be more of this as time goes on. So now do we need more laws about jailbreaking? Of course, under the DMCA, Digital Communications Millennial Act, it's illegal to hack anything, as though that's going to stop anybody. But now you've got these right to repair laws that are spreading somewhat across the country. There's pros and cons to them. Well, how about me upgrading my software or completely replacing the software in my car? You know, these guys that have slightly older cars, that have fuel injection, that maybe want a little more horsepower out of the car, they go ahead and they replace the chips that control the fuel injection, that control the engine. Maybe they replace the chips that control the transmission. And the whole idea there is to change the curves that are being used by those systems so that they can get some more speed out of the vehicle. Well, right to repair says, yeah, you can do that. You can, depending on the law, you can repair your car. You can replace all of the software. It's your car. You own it. But things have been changing so that it's not your car anymore. You don't own it. So what's going to end up happening? Let's say someone comes up with some better software. How about somebody lobotomizes the Tesla so that the computer controls all of your steering and the accelerator and the gas pedal, but you have 100% access to all of the features, and I don't want you tracking me. I don't want you uploading everything I do to the cloud, in Tesla's cloud. I don't want third parties to be able to come by and get that information from my car, maybe use it against me. Kind of goes on and on, right? Well, apparently this Tesla jailbreak, according to these hackers, is unpatchable and allows you to run arbitrary software on at least the infotainment system. So we got some problems. We're going to have to figure this whole thing out, okay? We got to figure it out. All right. Make sure you're on my email list, craigpeterson.com, okay? Let's make all of our lives a little bit more private and a little bit more safe. craigpeterson.com/subscribe. I've been helping a client recover after a kind of a nasty phishing event, and some of the nastiness that occurred afterwards is they're trying to fix some of those problems. And it came to me that this is something we all need to talk about. Well, the problem that they are having is that somehow someone took over control of their Microsoft Exchange tenant. Now, that's something a lot of businesses use. I mean, a lot. I am not a Microsoft fan, that's for sure, but most of our clients use it as well, so we have to maintain it for them, keep it up to date, and configure stuff in it, right? Now, there's a whole lot of stuff to configure, and it gets really kind of crazy. There's no two ways about that one. And what ended up happening, of course, is we had to come in after the fact and do a whole bunch of cleanup. who did those emails go to that were being sent from their domain, these phishing emails. Hopefully nobody fell for it. And then you got to work on the legal side. Well, what do we have to say and to whom? And, what's going on with all of this nastiness? It's absolutely incredible, the amount of work. And I've talked about this before many times, right? It takes hundreds of hours to recover after certain types of hacks and costs a whole lot of money. The bigger companies out there, just the medium-sized ones, the current number that I've seen is about a $3 million cost to try and recover from one of these types of hacks. Now, the good news here is there's no evidence anything was stolen. It was a target of opportunity. But it still is cleanup after cleanup after cleanup. Oh my gosh, such a pain. So I wanted to bring that up to everybody just so you remember a couple of things. One is you can never be 100% safe. And the really good news for us and our client is we had very good backups going back months. Daily backups, which we have since changed to backing up about every 4 hours. So there is a whole lot that you need to make sure works when it comes to backups. I'm not going to talk about backups today, but you can find more about it on the website. I've certainly talked about it on the radio before. But the big thing I really want to talk about is patching, because the problem most of us encounter is triggered by not having the latest software. There's 0-day vulnerabilities. These are vulnerabilities that almost nobody knows about other than the bad guys. And there's nothing you're going to be able to do to protect yourself against some of those. Obviously, you can try and keep your network edge nice and clean. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, but none of it is perfection, let me tell you. Very, very sure. So that's number one. Just like LifeLock says, right? They can't guarantee that they're going to be able to see everything that might happen, which is absolutely true. I'm not a LifeLock subscriber, just so that you know. But it's that same sort of mentality. The other one is if your computer is subjected to some form of malware, some form of hacking, well, that's where making sure you have the right patches really comes into play. Because, again, most of the time, the patches are going to fix things. But I want to point out that patches aren't just what you might get from Microsoft or Google or Apple. Patches have to be applied all over the place. Everything from your firewalls, your VPNs, to your computers, of course. But how about the light bulbs? How about the printers? Printers have been used to attack businesses before, because guess what? The printer is a computer. No two ways about it, because it has to do a whole bunch of work, right? It has to rasterize the image and control all of the mechanisms inside. It's a computer, and they can be used to launch attacks. Now, the way most attacks work is they get into a network, and then they try and move laterally within the network. In other words, they'll get onto one device, and they'll try and find other devices that might be vulnerable now that they have control over that one device inside the network, right? A very bad thing, at least for you, if they are controlling your device in the network. So that's the IoT side. We've got to remember that all of our devices that are computers and that are networked are potential vectors for the bad guys to get in. So keep that in mind. Now, there are some ways to find out about patches. And again, I'm not just talking about patches from your operating system vendor. I'm talking about patches for all of the software on your computers, about all of your devices, your IoT and everything else. And there are some ways to find out about it. But, I got to tell you, they are very confusing. It's hard to find it all in one place. And then the big question is priorities. That's one thing I've really noticed the last couple of weeks, again, while doing this recovery. my gosh, it is all consuming. And the same thing can be true when it comes to patches. If you're looking at the active patch lists, the CVEs as they're called that come out, we're talking about multiple patches every day. And we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of patches in a year. How can you possibly do all of that patching? You can't. How can you possibly keep track of which patches you really need to deploy because they are in the wild right now, the bad guys are using them, versus patches that, well, if you have any sort of a firewall, you're going to be safe? How do you do that? Well, I haven't found anything, and that's why I've been working on this whole patch aware thing so that you guys can sign up and get that type of information to help you prioritize what to patch, when to patch, why to patch, right? Put it all together. But at this point, try and find some mailing lists, email lists, subreddits, Facebook groups, whatever it might be. They're going to help you to know what you need to patch. And remember applications as well. Again, it's not just your operating system. You're running a whole bunch of different pieces of software on there. And it's going to vary depending on what kind of a home user you are, maybe what kind of a business you are. But all of that software should be getting patches because there's new vulnerabilities that are revealed, as I said, on a daily basis. So keep track of that. Windows Update is going to take care of your operating system. It might be taking care of your Microsoft applications. Still, almost every computer on your network will have third-party applications, things like PDF readers, media players, other business operation applications, things like accounting software, and on, right? So you got to stay on top of all of those patches. I know it's a lot of work, and that's what I'm hoping I can take care of with the patch aware thing. Drop me an email, me@craigpeterson.com. Let me know if you think that might be helpful to you. Maybe we can get you in on the alpha testing of this stuff. Again, patchaware.com. Next one is if you can test before you deploy. In other words, that computer that you're about to patch, make sure you have a good backup of it. And ideally, it's running in what's called a virtual space. So you're using something like VMware, which I recommend over all of the alternatives in most cases. And VMware allows you to just take a snapshot and do upgrades and then test your applications together. So if you don't have that kind of a virtual environment and you do have applications that you depend on and you are worried that that upgrade might make your application not work anymore, well, do what you can to test it. Make your own little lab, if you will. Have a computer or two computers that talk to each other that can now test to make sure that any patches you're applying don't break things. That's a large reason why businesses don't patch. I've been into businesses lately that are still running Windows XP. Yeah, and they're doing that because they're afraid that their applications are going to break, or more commonly, they don't want to upgrade the application. Sometimes the vendor of that software has gone out of business. Sometimes they don't have a version that's compatible at all, and there's no longer an upgrade path. There's a lot of reasons why businesses don't do the upgrades, but man, you got to do them. You've got to test. So having a set of machines that you can use to deploy patches first, I think is a really good idea. Also, maintenance windows. This came up in my business too here. One of our main file servers has been patched, right, as time goes on. And we need to reboot it because there were some kernel patches, in other words, down in the operating system. So we have to schedule a maintenance window. So remember that patching can require time, but it can also take time and bandwidth to reboot the machines, to maybe back out the patches if something breaks pretty badly. That's again why I think you should take advantage of virtualization technology if you can. But most companies are running their businesses more or less 24/7, even if it's not an open door 24/7. There's still people working from home, right? So you got to warn everybody. And then what happens if there's a 0-day exploit or a real important patch? Well, then you got to schedule that. You got to make sure people know about it. Our friends over at Apple have been issuing these little teeny patches, very quick patches to close up some 0-day attacks that had been going on, and they got them out right away. Kudos to them. And you hardly notice that you're applying the patch, but most of the time it still requires a reboot because some of these things are pretty nasty. Patch management can really help you out, and above all, make sure you have some form of a rollback plan because patches can break things. Make sure there's a way to go back to the way things were before, all right? All of this you'll find in the newsletter, craigpeterson.com/subscribe. It's even on the website, craigpeterson.com. We had a good article this week from Fox Business. Turns out that our friends over at ChatGPT, the creator OpenAI, is under investigation by the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. We're going to talk about it. Well, the Federal Trade Commission's job, if you will, is supposedly to protect consumers, right? You could argue that some of the things they do are far less protective of consumers than perhaps they might have been otherwise. But in this case, it's very interesting to read because we've talked about ChatGPT, right? There's these large language models, these AIs, machine learning, all of that sort of stuff many times before. And the concerns that are popping up now are a little different, but so much the same. And that is, there's two sides to this. If information is taken, if it's stolen, and is then used by somebody else to make money, is that legal? No. Obviously, it's not. So we now have some authors who are out there, some well-known authors who have put together a class action lawsuit. And some of them are actually suing individually saying, well, wait a minute now. What are you doing archiving all of our books? And there's a great lawsuit that was filed a few weeks back where the author had asked ChatGPT to summarize one of her books. And it did a very detailed summary. So obviously, ChatGPT had read her book, read in air quotes there, her book. And obviously, there is a certain point where if it reads the book and it comments on the book, in normal law, for instance, if I read a book and I'm sitting here and I'm telling you about it and talking about it and we're conversing about it, that's perfectly legal under the fair use doctrine. In other words, yeah, she wrote a book. I'm talking about the book, and that's going to help sell books, right? Well, how about if you are an author and your book is used in a context of, let's say, education? It might be high school, it might be college, it might be something else. And all people have to do is not even go and buy one of those little cheat books, but just ask ChatGPT about the book. How many people are going to buy the author's book at that point? And who owns what? I'm only aware of one court ruling that has really come out about this sort of thing. And the court at that point said, hey, guess what, guys? Anything produced by artificial intelligence is by definition uncopyrightable because it was produced by a machine. So something that comes out of ChatGPT can't be copyrighted. But what if, again, it's plagiarizing? Because remember, that's exactly how it works. That is precisely how large language models work. They are based on what it is that they have parsed. and try and figure out a word at a time. So what's the next word? What's the next word? What's the next word? Right? Does that make sense to you? So it cannot not plagiarize. Yeah, okay, it'll mess some words around a little bit, but it's 100% based on other people's work. We should talk about that as well, because that's actually presenting some interesting problems for ChatGPT. Many people are saying it has gotten worse lately. So in an open letter sent to OpenAI that the Washington Post had reported on, and the Wall Street Journal was able to confirm, it said that the FTC informed OpenAI, the ChatGPT guys, that the company is probing, or it's probing the company, whether it has engaged in unfair or deceptive practices related to data security or relating to risks of harm to consumers. Now, part of the data security thing is anything it generates, it uses later on. And anything you put into it can also be used and has been used. So what we've seen now is proprietary business information being put into ChatGPT for ChatGPT to come up with a marketing plan, write a letter, help write a report for the investors or whatever it might be. We've seen that information that was put into ChatGPT by companies and individuals now being leaked. So you could go and ask ChatGPT, tell me about the marketing that this such and such a company is in the process of doing, and it can tell you. Now, yeah, okay, some of the ChatGPT data sets are a couple of years out of date, but it's continually learning, quote unquote, as you're asking it questions, as you're feeding it data. So in this 20-page document, the FTC is demanding that OpenAI describes in detail its processes for developing and training any large language models, as well as policies and procedures for assessing risk and safety before releasing new products. So what we have found is they did something very similar to Mark Zuckerberg in Facebook, right? For something that was very underhanded and in some of the stuff alleged to be very, very illegal. Mark Zuckerberg decided what he would do in order to put together the Facebook is he scanned electronically here via the computer in the network I think it was Harvard, right? The Harvard pages of the students who were there. It's designed so you can contact another student if you're working on a project or you have a question, whatever it might be. And he took the pictures of the student, each student, and put them up online. And basically it was, so is this woman hot or not? Right? With stolen pictures. Right? It's incredible what happened. And then, of course, it grew and it grew and it's changed a whole lot since then. But and I'm simplifying it slightly as well. You might have seen, like, there was a movie about what had happened as well. So that's what he did. Well, guess what OpenAI's doing? Google, its whole business has been going online and scanning everything it can get its hands on, right? If you go to Google and you search for something, what happens? Well, as a rule, it has searched all kinds of, indexed all kinds of web pages. It's prioritized the web pages. It's tried to figure out what you mean and what the most correct answering web page would be. Let's put it that way. And lists the web pages with a slight summary. And the summary is usually skewed towards your question. So rather than just the first words on a web page, it's trying to help you understand, okay, this web page, here's what it's talking about, here's how it relates to what you want to do, right? Works, not bad. Now if you go online, if you've signed up for Bard, and if you're using your Google account, in particular if you're using the Chrome browser, what happens? Well, it comes up at the very top with a summary generated by Google Bard, which is the ChatGPT, if you will, coming from Google. And so Google Bard is now creating an answer that does not any longer require you to go to any of the websites where it gleaned the information and processes that information in order to give you that really nice little wrapped up summary. See what's going on here? So who owns what? It was bad enough when Google started putting little summaries up on pages. I remember the guffaw that came out of many people's mouths, guffaw, right? And I remember that very well because I was pretty upset too. Why should you not have to go to my webpage if you want to see my information? Well, this is kind of interesting because we're seeing this now in steroids because people are using ChatGPT. People are losing their jobs to ChatGPT. And the whole thing is as unfair as Mark Zuckerberg and the foundation of the Facebook. We know jobs are just disappearing, and they've been disappearing since time immemorial, right? Certainly since the 1900s, when we saw the horse and buggy disappear and automobiles took over, right? We lost a whole lot of jobs back then. Well, it was one thing to lose jobs for street sweepers who are going around after the horses and people that fed them and took care of them, etc., right? The stables, there's still a stable in New York City for some of these horses that give the tours of the park and all, right? It's kind of cool to think about, but look at how much better it's gotten from the days of the horse and buggy and today's day where we're driving cars around, burning gasoline or diesel, very efficiently getting places quickly, being able to stay cool, air conditioning. In fact, air conditioning has been blamed for a lot of societal problems down in New York City. You might ask, why, Craig? How could that be? Well, it used to be that it would get very hot in the summer, which it still does, of course, and that heat drove people out of those skyscrapers, their five-story walk-up, to the park. And people used to sleep in the park, and whole families would be there, and they'd toss ball around, they'd read books, and they'd know their neighbors. Versus today, with air conditioning, everyone stays kind of locked up inside, air conditioning on, right? So we've seen a lot of changes. We don't now have people delivering big cubes of ice to keep our ice box cool, do we? Well, we are seeing some jobs here, according to Finance Buzz, that are absolutely going to be gone in the 2030s. So they've got a list of 15 jobs, and I'm sure you can think of some. Now, remember 20 years ago when we were talking about AI, and we're talking about how things are going to change, and it's going to cause a lot of problems in some jobs and no problems in others, etc. Well, turns out that the number one job that they say is going to be extinct, and this isn't a job specifically, but assembly line jobs. Just think of what we've done so far. Look at some of the plants, for instance, that have been built by Tesla that are almost completely automated. There's plants in China making cars, the same sort of thing. No people involved. Of course, unions haven't been happy about that, and there's a lot of people that argue that that's part of the problem with the U.S. auto industry. They just can't innovate because the unions force them not to, right? So blue-collar workers standing up against the bosses at the plant, well, AI doesn't care. Right? So a lot of traditional assembly line tasks that are involving repetitive manual labor, basic product assembly, that are already moving towards automation. Many of them are already automated, but it's going to move even more by these AI-driven machines as they can look at a product that's sitting there and maybe something isn't quite right. It might be a little off-center and used to require a human just to make sure that it was done properly. Well, now it can figure it out itself, right? So that's been going on for decades. Assembly line jobs gone, they say. Data analysts. This came up today too, but it's unlikely that the good old human data analyst jobs are going to be eradicated by AI, but they are going to be a lot different. And I'm not just talking about going to a language like R for those of you who are in that business. But AI can analyze large data sets and generate insights. I did that with my own articles. My wife Karen and I have been writing articles for a long time. In fact, we deleted over 1,000 articles off of the craigpeterson.com website because it was just getting so big and it was costing us a lot just to have it up online. And, are you really interested in an article from 15, 20 years ago? Probably not. So we deleted about 1,000. And I think I've got 2,000 or 3,000 articles left. I got to go through and kind of whack them. But anyways, I used some libraries that are out there and designed and put together a large language model, an AI, if you will, kind of like ChatGPT, and trained it on my articles. And I did it as kind of an exercise to see, what would it be like? Is this hard to do? Is this easy to do? What kind of answers would I get? And I was actually fairly impressed, although it took 2 to 4 minutes to answer a question, but it answered them just like I would because it had analyzed what I had written. It's very good at that sort of thing. So data analysts, the careers are going to change. Humans are still going to play a critical role in defining objectives, doing some of the result interpretation and providing some context. But I got to tell you, I was impressed. I did it myself, right, with my own articles. Bank tellers are already kind of on the way out. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're saying that they're going to see a loss of about 43,000 bank tellers. And we're already seeing that. We're seeing that in a very big way, where the bank tellers are being replaced by, they're kind of like an ATM almost. There's one at our local Walmart, and it's a different kind of ATM. I hadn't really seen these before, but it's almost like you're on a Zoom call with a teller located somewhere. The teller could be at home, who knows, right? And that teller can answer your questions, move stuff around. Of course, the machine itself can do all of that, and it can look at your face and do an ID based on your face. It's the need for in-person banking services has really dropped dramatically. I don't like part of that. I was doing business, and my first real business where I had large bank accounts and everything else was back in the 70s. And back then, or 80s, yeah, it was the 80s really. Back then, you knew the bank manager, president, right? Every branch had a president, and you knew the vice president, and they knew you, and they would lend money based on you and who you are, right? What FICO score? And it was great. They treated me well. I treated them well. I had loyalty to them. And recently we went into the bank and sat down with the branch manager and talked with her about, okay, here we'd like to do an equity line, and because we want to fix this and that in the house, and it went almost all the way through, and then the machine ultimately kicked it back. Everything was good, credit rating was good, everything was good, but it didn't like the fact that I'm self-employed, right? Yes and no, right? Am I self-employed? Depends on the definition. But it didn't like that most of my income was coming from a business. It just couldn't understand that. So it denied it. That's why I don't like it. And how about people who are going to be denied loans in the future? You want to buy a house. Well, where is the house? And we've had problems with redlining before, where certain neighborhoods, you couldn't get a loan. In some cases, it had to do with your race. They wouldn't lend you money if you weren't a white male, for instance. In fact, it was illegal at one point in certain parts of the country. So how are you going to make sure that those types of biases don't show up in these AIs that are going to be making some of these decisions? There's no way to. And particularly when you pile on top of this, that the people that design these AIs, that put them in place, can't even tell you how an AI reached a certain decision. They can certainly tell you, okay, well, we do this and we do that, and basically it's going back to the old calculus days in college, right, in statistics. Okay, fine, but how did it come to the conclusion that John Doe is guilty of this crime? How did it do that? They don't know. So we're facing that as well. Very, very scary, frankly. But other jobs, drivers, fast food workers, medical diagnosticians, and more, going to be lost. Stick around. Visit me online, craigpeterson.com. We got a couple articles this week about cars we're going to talk on right now. About your new car and its tracking ability. It's a gold mine. And we're going to talk about EVs. A couple more articles and this week in the newsletter online, craigpeterson.com. Do you have an electric vehicle? Why did you buy that electric vehicle? There have been some studies out there over the years about these hybrids and electric vehicles and why people are buying them. I can tell you the reason why they're being manufactured. It's because of federal government requirements, these CAFE standards that they put in place, where they are forcing companies to make electric cars. That is causing some problems. Right, like that's a surprise. So let's start with these new cars and how they're tracking you. Remember that the cars of tomorrow are going to be self-driving. There's no two ways about this. And tomorrow, not necessarily next week, next year, but they will be completely autonomous. How can they make an autonomous car? Well, they have to train it, don't they? How do you train things like large language models? How do you train things like cars? Well, you need a lot of data. You need to know precisely where the roads are. Well, you can find that by having people use your GPS. And the GPS is sending back signals telling the company exactly where you are on the road. So it now knows exactly where the road is. And then it needs to know also where are people driving, what kind of routes, alternate routes could be taken, how can we avoid a traffic jam, what time are there usually traffic jams. It's a lot of data. And there's a great story on Wired.com that was in this week's newsletter that you can get for free at craigpeterson.com. And Wired's talking about how modern cars are producing 25 gigabytes of data per hour. Amazing, isn't it? No joke. And this Wired analysis that was done, that's in this story as well, of the 10 most popular U.S. cars, shows that they are all collecting a lot of data. And they may know more about you than your friends and families do. Because it's not just that GPS data that they're collecting. Many of them have other sensors. They might have LiDAR, and that's certainly the case for some of these semi-self-driving cars that are out there. But it's just more and more data. So what's interesting to me is there's a U.S. automotive firm called Privacy for Cars that's come out with a tool that they call the Vehicle Privacy Report. And this report kind of reveals how much information on your car can be sucked up by the manufacturers. So if you go to vehicleprivacyreport.com and you enter in your 17-digit VIN, I think it's safe to do that. It's easy enough to find VINs. You just walk around a parking lot and look in the windows, right? Windshields. But you enter the VIN and then you can find out from this site here, again, it's vehicleprivacyreport.com, what kind of data they are able to gather on you and you traveling. Now, some of it, of course, has to do with cameras that are looking at you from inside the car so that they can then look at you and say, oh, he's falling asleep, he's not paying attention, etc., and kind of wake you up and get you going again, right? That's not bad. But how about this other biometric information? Right? The cars can track where you're traveling to and from, but they can also record every time you touch that accelerator, how hard you're pushing it down, how hard you're braking, are your seat belts fastened, And then information about you. Some of these cards are locking and unlocking based on facial ID, or sometimes fingerprints, or even iris scans, right? That's coming down the road at us. And some of this data is being sold to the data broker industry and is then being resold to insurers, to the government, and to many others that are out there. Interesting, isn't it? So it's showing this, again, vehicleprivacyreport.com, how much information your car is gathering and how much might be used. So this is kind of like Apple has this privacy label for apps. Google has it for the Android. And it shows how Facebook might use your camera, how Uber might use your location data. This tool indicates that the vehicle manufacturers can suck up some of this information. So it's very interesting to kind of go through this. Wired ran 10 of the most popular cars. And their, let's see, results. Let me just scroll down here. You can read the whole article. Again, I got a link to it on my website and in this week's newsletter. So they used, let's see, Toyota, Honda, Ford, Chevy, Ram, Jeep, and ran them all through the tools. These results only apply, by the way, to the U.S. Different countries have different laws about privacy, and in fact, even different states here in the U.S. Saying a lot of these cars have kind of the same thing, a lot of technical legal files. So let's start with Toyota. Camry, Tacoma, RAV4, and Highlander. Those are the ones that they picked and they looked at. And the privacy documentation that came from the vehicle privacy tool is the same for all of the 2022 models. Some older cars might collect less data, but they're going to collect, obviously, your personal information that they're using as a classifier. That's things like your name, your address, driver's license number, the phone number, email, other information. You give it to the dealer when you're buying the car. And Toyota's no different than others. Toyota has a privacy document. This is just crazy. Publicly available, 31,000 words. One key document is Toyota's Connected Services Privacy Notice, which details what can be collected. Toyota, some of them can scan your face for face recognition when you come in. It goes on and on. They got the Honda Civic and CR-V, the Ford F-150. It's only one model that they checked, but it is in the recent list of the best sellers. Most popular across all categories and most of the time, right? Ford's got great products. Certainly the F-150, I owned one for quite a while till it got into an accident. Not my fault. But they collect information about who owns it, names, location, details, driver license data. It's everybody, okay? I'm not going to bore you by going through all of these details. But it is a problem. No question about it. Now, let's talk about EVs, because I got a couple articles on EVs this week and another one on Amazon, where Amazon had delivered something to a house, and the house had one of these camera doorbells, and it automatically, when someone approaches the door, issues a greeting. Yeah, no problem, right? Well, the Amazon driver apparently mistook the greeting, which was a nice greeting. It was the default greeting, and said that this guy had, I think it was a racial slur, okay? So he reported it to his bosses at Amazon, and that very day, Amazon shut everything down, right? Everything down. And this guy's house was completely driven by the Amazon technology, right? The Alexas and everything else. So he was out in the cold. Oh, man, what a pain. So remember that, too. If you're going to really automate your house, make sure you got a back way in, right? Back door, if you will. Have we reached peak virtue signaling with EVs? Remember what we talked about probably, 20 years ago? When did the Prius come out? And there was a survey that was done of Prius owners, and the survey found number one answer why people bought and drove Priuses was number one, 70%. Because of what the purchaser of the Prius thought other people would think of them. Yeah, virtue signaling, by far. And there are a lot of people that drive EVs for that very same reason. Of course, I keep repeating, don't think that they are green, because they are not. And there's a great article I have this week that hits an angle I had never thought of before, and I don't know why I hadn't, but I should have. And here's the bottom line. This is an article from townhall.com, and it's saying that electric cars are a scam. And the reason is that on average, your new electric car isn't even carbon neutral until it hits 70,000 miles. Now, when you break this down, what does a new car cost? Well, according to the statistics that I saw most recently, $50,000 on average for a new car. Can most people afford the monthly payments on a $50,000 car? Heck no, right? I think that's pretty obvious. So what do? Well, they lease the car. Well, these lease contracts have mileage allotments, right? And they're usually for, about 3 years? So if we say that you can put 30,000 miles on that car, and then you turn it in, which most people apparently, I don't know if it's most, a large number of people who bought EVs just turn them in and walk away from them and say, forget this is ridiculous. That car never reached carbon neutral status. You say, okay, great. So now it's at the dealer and someone else will buy it used. No. People are not buying used EVs because they're not dumb. Buying a used EV means you may have to replace a battery pack that may cost $20,000. It's going to cost you at least $12,000. Can't think of an exception offhand. Are you going to buy a used car that you immediately have to put, let's say, $15,000 into? No, of course you're not. Now, of course, that car might not need a new battery pack yet, but people are just not willing to take the risk, and I understand why. So don't worry. Ford's EV losses are projected to hit about $5.1 billion in 2023. Yeah. When is this stupidity going to stop? With the federal government mandating things that society, industry, etc. just aren't ready for. Let's take this slowly, people. Hey, sign up, get the newsletter right now, craigpeterson.com.